How are you? Welcome back. Nice to see you. You had a good time? I'm sorry it's going to be a wet procession around the garden. But we Navy guys can cope with that. No, right. Do come in. Numbers, a lot of people are away, needless to say, for the holidays.
It's my spiritual responsibility to care for them and to provide for them in St. Andrews, Moscow, a home for home.
Dr. Reverend Simon Stevens, Officer OBE RN, after having sailed around the world as chaplain on Her Majesty's warships, came ashore. And then, 7 years ago, he became chaplain at the unique Anglican St. Andrew's Church in Moscow. Wearing his robe, he looks rather unusual in the streets of Russia's capital. Also unusual is the building of his church, whose red brick Gothic tower rises on the background of Moscow's skyline. Some people take it for a former Catholic or Lutheran cathedral. Some mention a recording studio based there. However, this building, like the people linked to it, has its own fascinating story.
Many Russians have no idea about the Anglican Church or the Catholic Church. They are Orthodox believers, and they're coming into a non-Orthodox environment, and they fear for their soul. And my responsibility to the Archbishop of Canterbury is to enable Russians to understand where the Anglican Church has come from, what it's doing in the city, and where it's going in its ministry. We are not here to attract members of the Orthodox Church and Russians here. We are here to care for the large expatriate community.
It's a pity that today only specialists know that the Anglican Confession was the first non-Russian Orthodox faith to be allowed in Russia. The story begins here, at this very old building, only a stone's throw away from Red Square. It is known as Old English Yard, and was actually the very first foreign embassy established in Russia. Historian Alexander Sotin has a passion for the more than 400-year-old history of British-Russian relations.
In 1553 AD, an English ship, the Edward Bonaventure, by mistake or by a stroke of fate, reached neither India nor China, but the shores of the White Sea.
Among the courageous British navigators that plowed the seas looking for the Northeast Passage to Asia, Captain Richard Chancellor was the luckiest. When Tsar Ivan the Terrible heard of the arrival of the exotic guest, he immediately invited him to visit Moscow. Both quickly appreciated the huge trade perspectives opening up for the two countries. The new trading fellowship called the Russia or Muscovy Company was chartered in 1555. Trade development flourished, among other things, thanks to allowance given to the English traders to celebrate non-Orthodox services. Despite personal differences between Ivan the Terrible and Elizabeth I, trade interest always came before everything. There's an anecdote that one day, while listening to the sounds of the outlandish Russian language, Her Majesty said, "Oh, I could quickly learn it."
My Russian is very poor, and most of Moscow knows that, but they help me to find the right words for the right occasion.
Coffee latte, пожалуйста, and Yuri? Small. Mr. Bien. Спасибо. We have much in records since the Russia Company came here in 1553, 1555, but also we have parts of the jigsaw puzzle which are missing, like the names of the family, all the families, their relationships with Russia of the time. And I suspect that somewhere in Moscow, somewhere in London, and somewhere in St. Petersburg, the missing pieces of the jigsaw puzzle still have to be discovered. And that makes it very exciting to find out what is actually going on. about who was here, who forms the society here at the time.
The history of the British community in Russia was punctuated by the political situation of the time. In the middle of the 17th century, the Russian Tsar, Alexei Mikhailovich, deeply shocked by the execution of King Charles I, expelled the English merchants from Muscovy. In Peter the Great's time, the friendly relationships were restored and continued to thrive so successfully that before the Russian Revolution in 1917, the British living in Russia composed a large and well-established community. As the Scots were the most respected and richest members of Moscow's Anglican congregation, the church building constructed in Moscow in the 1880s was named in honor of the Apostle St. Andrew, the patron of Scotland. The church's architect, Richard Knill Freeman, could never have imagined what destiny his creation would have, and what would save it from demolition during the upcoming Soviet era.
Before the revolution here, if you were part of the British community, you could take a safety deposit box to put your jewels, your private papers, money, so on and so forth. Only it wasn't very safe in 1918.
Pat, a former Chicago Tribune reporter, landed in Moscow several years ago to become a kind of fairy godmother of St. Andrew's Church. Clever and with a good sense of humor, she seems to be everywhere and to know everything.
This is the room in the tower, which during the revolution was used as a machine gun nest by the Bolsheviks. If you come over to this window here, you can see 4 bullet holes where fighting occurred. The St. Andrew's Bell Tower was the highest point, other than the Kremlin, in this whole neighborhood.
There's also a legend that our flowers are the first spring flowers in Moscow because of the blood shed here during the revolution. So we are blessed with these spring flowers, but they are a solemn reminder of those who died in stormy days here in Russia.
The building of St. Andrews, as you know, was built at the end of the 19th century, and very clearly Victorian church architects knew exactly what they were doing as far as acoustics were concerned, because that has been the saving factor of this church as a building. Immediately after the revolution, it was used for various purposes, but from the 1960s onwards, it became a recording studio for Melodia, because they also understood the benefit of having a building here with just superb acoustics.
I was part of a student trip to Moscow in 1973, and we all came home with, 4 or 5 recordings of Red Army march music and so forth, and all with the Melodia label. And I had no idea that one day, I'd be the church warden in the Anglican church, where indeed all of these recordings were made and where the processing was done and so forth.
By a stroke of fate, the superb acoustics of the church primarily was the factor that saved it, but later became a troublesome factor in the story. And the name of Elizabeth once again came to the fore of the historical scene.
Queen Elizabeth is technically head of the Church of England. We were able to use that to suggest to the Russian government that it would be highly embarrassing if Her Majesty were to come here and we would have to explain to her that we really were not in possession of the property.
But first came some sophisticated protocol preparations.
When Queen Elizabeth II visited Moscow on her state visit, she came to St. Andrews, Moscow. Half of the church council were English, half of the church council were Americans. The English were very laid back about the whole thing. The English were, oh, well, Her Majesty's coming, that's very lovely, la 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 la, da 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 da. However, the Americans, we went crazy, making sure that, we had all this protocol down and everything. And the women, for a week before, were practicing the curtsy. Were we doing the curtsy correctly? I still don't think I know how to do the curtsy correctly, but we were you know, not going to make any sort of faux pas or anything, you know, in front of our English friends. And so we got the curtsy down. She looks me in the eye and she says to me, "You're all on the church council." To which I said, "Yes, ma'am," and did my little curtsy.
It's unknown what role Pat's carefully rehearsed curtsy played. However, it's definitely known that the intermediacy of two heads of state once again determined the destiny of the Moscow Anglican community. The question of restoring the church's ownership of the buildings finally moved out of a stalemate.